They told you tariffs would destroy the economy. They told you foreign partnerships were sacred. They told you Donald Trump didn't understand trade. But now, just months after the media assured us he was politically finished, he's back at the negotiating table. And this time, he's rewriting the rules in a way they never thought possible. On July 2nd, 2025, with almost no media fanfare, Trump announced a groundbreaking trade deal with Vietnam. 20% tariffs on all imports, 40% on transshipped goods, which are China's favorite loophole, and in return, Vietnam will allow American exports in tariff-free. It's a masterstroke of economic nationalism disguised as diplomacy. But here's the part that should stop you cold. The press barely mentioned it. No CNN headline, no Sunday segment on 60 Minutes, no front page splash in the New York Times. Why? Because the deal proves one thing they can't afford to acknowledge, that Trump's trade doctrine works, that tariffs aren't the disaster they screamed about, that a strong America doesn't beg for terms, it sets them. And if that truth spreads, their entire system, their outsourcing racket, their China first loyalties, their globalist pipeline begins to crumble. Because this wasn't just a trade deal, it was a warning shot, and they heard it loud and clear. On July 2nd, 2025, Donald Trump did something that was once declared impossible. He negotiated a trade deal that punished China, protected American industry, and did it without a single dollar of taxpayer subsidy or a whisper of congressional approval. A direct America First agreement with Vietnam, 20% tariffs on all Vietnamese imports, 40% on transshipped goods, the very scheme China has used for years to dodge American enforcement. And in exchange, tariff-free access for U.S. goods flowing into Vietnam, not a compromise, not a concession, a strategic chokehold on Beijing's backdoor pipeline, and a green light for American manufacturing and agriculture to roar back. But you wouldn't know any of this if you turned on the news. CNN didn't lead with it. MSNBC buried it behind stories about climate disinformation. The New York Times didn't even mention it in their top five. And when they did cover it, they called it risky, unpredictable, a threat to the global supply chain. Not a victory, not a breakthrough, not even a policy debate. Just another chance to scold Trump for refusing to play by their sacred globalist rules. Why? Because this wasn't just a trade announcement. It was a strategic blow to the system they've been defending for decades. A system where America is always the buyer, never the seller, always the borrower, never the lender. A system where elites get rich off cheap labor overseas while working class Americans get pink slips and empty towns. Trump's deal with Vietnam didn't just fix a loophole, it exposed one. A massive, rotting lie buried deep in America's trade consensus. The lie that globalism is inevitable, that tariffs can't work, that American leverage is a myth, that any attempt to rebalance trade is xenophobic, isolationist, or reckless. But here was proof, in plain, negotiable terms, that the opposite is true, that if America sets the terms, others will come to the table, that if you stop begging and start bargaining, the game changes, and that if you make cheating expensive, even Beijing-backed proxies like Vietnam will stop being useful middlemen. But if the media had acknowledged that, if they had honestly reported the structure and substance of this deal, they would have had to admit something else, that Trump was right, not just once, repeatedly, and that the people who laughed at him, smeared him, and tried to cancel him were wrong. So instead, they went silent. Not because they didn't understand it, but because they did. Because Trump didn't just negotiate with Vietnam, he outmaneuvered an entire globalist establishment that depends on you never understanding how trade really works. They need you distracted by buzzwords like supply chain instability and multilateral cohesion, while they rake in profits from offshored factories and underpaid foreign labor. They need you to believe that tariffs hurt consumers, but they never explain how Walmart's CEO still gets his bonus. They scream that Trump's actions will provoke retaliation, but they never ask why our trading partners are always allowed to retaliate and we are expected to surrender. That's not journalism, that's cartel propaganda. And they're panicking now because their favorite talking points just collapsed. This was supposed to be the moment when Trump faded from relevance, when lawsuits and media noise finally buried him. Instead, he's driving global markets, controlling trade headlines, and proving that America doesn't need to play by anyone else's rules, not Beijing's, not Brussels, and certainly not CNN's. So let's ask the obvious question. If they're willing to bury a major trade win that helps American farmers, auto workers, steel producers, and tech exporters, what else are they suppressing? How many deals have been discredited simply because they came from Trump? How many policies have been discarded because they didn't align with the donor class? How many more victories for ordinary Americans have been erased simply because they make the wrong people look foolish? This isn't about tariffs anymore. It's about control. The press isn't neutral, and they never were. They don't report what's happening. They decide what's allowed to happen. They aren't missing the story. They are the story. They told you Trump was dangerous for defying the WTO. Then he cut bilateral deals that outpaced any multilateral pact in a generation. They told you tariffs would crash the economy. Instead, American industrial production is up and dependency on Chinese inputs is down. They told you trade wars can't be won. Trump's proving they can be avoided entirely. If the other side knows you'll fight to win. And now that it's working, the only card they have left to play is silence. Because if Americans realize that we can renegotiate our sovereignty, reclaim our leverage, reverse decades of economic surrender with a single stroke of strong leadership, then the globalist consensus collapses overnight. And make no mistake, they're not going down without a fight. Because Trump's strategy doesn't just threaten their profits, it threatens their worldview, a world where America must ask permission, where we're told our labor is too expensive, where our factories are considered relics, and where every working family must accept a future of dependency while Wall Street calls it growth. But what happens when the people wake up and realize they've been sold a bill of goods? What happens when the silence becomes too obvious to ignore? Because the media's refusal to cover this deal isn't incompetence, it's survival instinct, and Trump's success proves they're losing control of the story. The left doesn't fear Donald Trump because he's bombastic. They don't fear him because of his rallies or his nicknames or his social media platform. No, the real fear, the kind that keeps them up at night, is the fact that Trump has done something no modern president has dared to do. He's rewritten the rules of global trade, and it's working. The Vietnam deal didn't just impose tariffs, it reimposed American leverage. It didn't punish, it conditioned. It didn't isolate, it compelled. And for the first time in years, a foreign nation chose access to American markets on America's terms, not the World Trade Organization's, not China's, ours. You want to know why the legacy media didn't cover it? Why the New York Times kept the story in the basement while the Wall Street Journal ran op-eds calling it short-sighted? Because this wasn't just a trade pact, it was proof of concept. It validated everything the global elite has fought to discredit since 2016, that America can still win, that America can dictate the rules, that American workers don't have to compete with sweatshops in Hanoi or Shandong for wages that barely buy bread, that our economy doesn't have to be plugged into Beijing's grid to grow. For decades, the people running this country told us the opposite, that globalization was inevitable, that free trade was sacrosanct, that comparative advantage meant surrendering entire industries to cheaper labor abroad. They said tariffs were dangerous, that reshoring was expensive, that trade deficits were nothing to worry about, just accounting quirks. But look what those theories gave us. The collapse of the Rust Belt, dependence on Chinese steel, pharmaceutical plants in Wuhan instead of Wisconsin, tech supply chains that could be shut down with a single CCP decree, and an entire generation of Americans who grew up thinking their only future was a service job and a college loan. Trump broke that model in 2018, and in 2025 he's refining it. The establishment calls it protectionism. But that's a lie. This is not about hiding from the world. It's about leading it on American terms. And what Trump has shown, yet again, is that the greatest weapon in the U.S. arsenal isn't a drone or a missile. It's the U.S. consumer. And for the first time in modern history, a leader is willing to use that weapon to fight for Americans instead of apologizing for them. Tariffs are not taxes, they are tools, negotiating instruments, leverage points. When deployed strategically, they don't raise costs, they raise stakes. And that's exactly what this deal with Vietnam has done. It made cheating expensive, it made access conditional, and it made Beijing nervous because China's workaround, the transshipment racket where goods sneak in through third-party nations, just got plugged. If other countries follow this model, China's dominance ends without a single carrier strike group moving an inch. That's the nightmare scenario for globalists. Because if one country, just one, proves that Trump's strategy works, the entire neoliberal trade order begins to crack. If it works with Vietnam, what happens when it's replicated with India, with Brazil, with Eastern Europe? Suddenly, American manufacturing isn't a relic, it's the standard. Suddenly, China's industrial leverage collapses. Wall Street's outsourcing pipeline dries up. And Washington lobbyists lose the grip they've held over trade policy since NAFTA was signed. That's why they can't let you see this work, because this isn't just about economics, it's about ideology. The Trump doctrine represents more than tariffs and trade balances. It represents a complete inversion of their worldview, that American strength comes from independence, not entanglement, that foreign cooperation must be earned, not assumed, and that a sovereign economy, one not dependent on hostile regimes, is not a fantasy. It's a necessity. The media's silence isn't editorial oversight, it's protection. They are shielding the old order from public recognition that the emperor has no clothes. If the average voter understands that we can impose 20% tariffs, plug Chinese loopholes, and still increase American exports without inflation or economic collapse, the illusion falls apart, the consensus dies, the gatekeepers lose their script. Because at its core, Trump's model is not about punishment, it's about dignity, about reclaiming the ability to choose our own future instead of accepting one outsourced by international financiers and diplomatic appeasers. The global elite don't care if you lose your job so long as quarterly profits rise. They don't care if Ohio towns collapse so long as DC dinners are well attended. They don't fear populism because it's extreme. They fear it because it's effective. And this deal with Vietnam, it's effective. It proves that America can rebuild its industrial base without subsidies, that we can defend our markets without apology, that trade can be a tool of renewal instead of ruin, that economic nationalism isn't isolation, it's intelligence. And that's why the left, along with their think tanks, networks, and international enablers, cannot afford to let this narrative take hold. If the public sees it work once, they'll demand it again, and again, and again, until the old guard is gone and the new reality, one built around American strength, is here to stay. So the question now isn't whether Trump's model works, it's whether the momentum can survive the media blackout designed to bury it. Because if America sees the power of this trade strategy, if we realize we can win without asking permission, then the establishment doesn't just lose the argument, it loses control. This moment is not an accident, it's a call to action. The success of Trump's Vietnam trade deal is more than a singular victory. It's a blueprint for dismantling the globalist structure that has drained America's wealth and exported its sovereignty piece by piece for the last 50 years. But if we want to finish the job, if we want to turn this win into a revolution, we need a plan as bold, deliberate, and unapologetically American as the man behind it. And it starts by scaling the model that worked. Vietnam agreed to 20% tariffs on all their exports to the U.S., with an even higher 40% on transshipped goods, specifically those rerouted from China to dodge American laws. In return, Vietnam gets tariff-free access for U.S. goods. That's not just a trade agreement, that's leverage at work. And this model should be applied across the board. India, Brazil, Mexico, Eastern Europe. Any country that wants access to the U.S. consumer must play by American terms, not WTO fairy tales. Trump's doctrine makes trade conditional, strategic, controlled, reciprocal, not negotiated by diplomats chasing headlines, but by patriots demanding results. Next, Trump must create what the Biden administration was too compromised to even whisper: a trade strike force, a hybrid unit that combines the power of the Department of Justice with the trade acumen of the U.S. Trade Representative. Its sole mission? Hunt down transshipment fraud. We know China launders its exports through Vietnam, Malaysia, even Canada. This task force would be equipped with advanced AI tools, shipping ledger audits, and port of origin forensics to expose the network of deception that props up Beijing's trade war against us. Then we rate our partners openly. A Made in America sovereignty index would grade countries based on how fairly they trade, whether they enable fraud, and how aligned they are with U.S. supply chain security. If a country scores low, they pay higher tariffs. If they cheat, they lose access. We publish it. We teach it. We make sure every American knows which countries are playing fair and which are parasites feeding off the American consumer. But tariffs and enforcement are just one side of the coin. The other is rebuilding American capacity. Trump must tie tax breaks directly to the repatriation of supply chains from China. No more vague promises. If a company brings its factory back to Texas, it gets a break. If it opens a plant in Arizona instead of Anhui, it gets a deduction. If it sources components from Ohio instead of Guangdong, it gets to keep more of its earnings. That's how you realign incentives, by making it more profitable to produce in America than to exploit cheap labor abroad. And all of it must be codified into a Trump-led reciprocity doctrine. No nation gets better terms than it gives us, period. You sell here, you buy here, you want to export 200 billion in goods, then open your markets to 200 billion of ours. You manipulate currency or subsidize dumping, you lose access, no more unilateral surrender, no more trade deficits treated like growth, no more diplomatic excuses dressed up as economic strategy. We deal in strength or we don't deal at all. And while the executive branch implements these policies, Congress must finally be put to work doing what it should have done years ago, pass permanent anti-transshipment laws. That means giving Customs and Border Protection the digital tools, shipping analytics, and legal teeth to flag fraud automatically. It means automatic tariff hikes for countries caught violating rules of origin. It means stopping China's end runs around U.S. law cold. At the same time, Trump must defund the international NGOs and trade foundations that openly lobby against American interests. Groups like the International Trade Center and World Economic Forum affiliates that use U.S. taxpayer dollars to shame America for defending itself. These groups don't serve trade, they serve globalism, and we shouldn't fund our own economic sabotage. But perhaps most importantly, Trump must change how we think about trade altogether. This can't just be a fiscal issue, it must become a cultural one, a patriotic one, because trade is not just numbers, it's sovereignty. It's the right to decide who gets access to your people, your market, your values. Every factory that opens in the U.S. is a vote for independence. Every manufacturing job saved is a brick in the wall between this nation and economic submission. We need to teach voters, especially young ones, that factories are not relics, they are fortresses, that supply chains aren't just about logistics, they're about loyalty. That American made isn't just a slogan, it's a declaration that we will never again tie our future to regimes that hate us. This agenda isn't radical, it's overdue. For too long, our leaders outsourced everything but accountability. They let unelected bureaucrats in Brussels write trade policy. They let Beijing dictate supply chains. They told us the price of globalization was worth it, while entire cities were hollowed out and millions of workers were told to learn to code or die trying. But that era is ending. Trump's plan doesn't apologize for American greatness, it demands it. It doesn't chase foreign approval, it commands respect. And now that we have proof this model works, real proof, not theory or projection, the only thing left is to expand it, defend it, and explain it to every American who's been lied to for decades about what's possible. Because the media can ignore one success, but they can't ignore a movement. And the momentum is already here because the American people aren't just waking up, they're organizing, voting, and fighting back faster than the global elite can bury the evidence. This isn't speculation anymore, it's confirmation. When Donald Trump announced his new trade framework with Vietnam, 20% tariffs on imports, 40% on transshipped goods, and zero tariffs on American exports, He didn't just unveil a policy, he detonated a paradigm. And despite the corporate media's effort to strangle the story in its crib, the numbers are beginning to roar louder than the narrative. Within just days of the announcement, polling among voters in industrial states, Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, showed overwhelming support. Over 70% backed retaliatory tariffs on transshipped goods, especially when framed as a direct measure to punish Chinese circumvention. These aren't ideologues or pundits. These are the people who've lived through the decay of American industry, who watched their steel mills collapse while politicians called it progress. They're not buying the globalist excuses anymore. They're buying into the results. And the markets, they didn't just react, they surged. American manufacturing output ticked up within a week, especially in sectors that have been hollowed out for decades: auto, steel, aluminum, and industrial tools. In Illinois and Ohio, factory owners reported a flurry of new orders from domestic suppliers who no longer had to compete with artificially cheap Vietnamese steel masked as Chinese exports. In Indiana, tool and die shops that were facing layoffs in Q2 are suddenly hiring again, hedging on what they call the first fair trade deal since Reagan. But it's not just industry, it's agriculture too. Farmers' unions, long wary of Trump's tariffs, are flipping. Why? Because under this deal, their soybeans, corn, pork, and dairy products enter Vietnam tariff-free. Let that sink in. While the media warns of supply chain instability, farmers in Iowa and Nebraska are celebrating what they're calling a clean win. No middlemen, no retaliatory taxes, no import quotas, just straight access to a booming Southeast Asian market that used to belong to China. Even more striking is what's happening outside the political trenches. Independent economists, many of them no fans of Trump, are publicly praising the strategy, not because they suddenly became conservative, but because the numbers don't lie. This wasn't a trade war, it was trade leverage, a precision strike instead of a carpet bomb. And it worked. They admit it, quietly, begrudgingly, but undeniably. Meanwhile, social media lit up within hours of the announcement, but not with partisan outrage, with relief. Thousands of small business owners, exporters of machinery, automotive parts, farming equipment, even consumer goods, posted videos, charts, and stories showing how their costs are finally falling. Why? Because Trump's framework didn't just go after China. It rewarded American exporters. It realigned the battlefield. And for the first time in years, Washington picked its own team to win. Conservative outlets ran with the story, yes. But even global markets couldn't deny the shift. Vietnam's stock exchange surged by 8% in 48 hours, the clearest possible signal that Trump's strategy wasn't isolationist. It was directional. It said, if you want access to the American consumer, bring something to the table besides cheap labor and empty promises. And Vietnam answered, willingly, enthusiastically, because they understand something our media still pretends not to. Trump isn't just fighting China, he's repositioning allies. And speaking of China, within 24 hours of the deal's announcement, Beijing released an official statement accusing the U.S. of economic coercion. Good. That statement was a confession, a signal flare, a panic broadcast to the rest of the world that the backdoor trade routes they've used for years are now in Trump's crosshairs. They called it a threat, but we should call it what it is: confirmation. Proof the strategy didn't just land, it struck at the core of the system they've been rigging for decades. And that's exactly why the media buried it. They don't hide things that fail, they hide things that succeed, especially when they vindicate everything Trump has said about trade since 2016. The less they say, the more you know it worked. Their silence is the scoreboard. Because if this deal had collapsed, if it had triggered a market sell-off, if Vietnam had retaliated with its own tariffs, we all know it would have led CNN's broadcast for 72 hours. Rachel Maddow would have performed a special segment with maps and graphs. The New York Times would have had 5 opinion pieces calling it a disaster and 2 more comparing it to the Smoot-Hawley Act, but none of that happened. Instead, they blinked. And in that moment, Trump redefined the rules of global trade in real time, without a treaty, without a summit, without permission. He didn't ask the WTO for clearance. He didn't need a multinational consensus. He negotiated powerfully acted unilaterally, and delivered immediately. And in doing so, he exposed what generations of economists, diplomats, and corporate executives never wanted the public to realize, that America still has the leverage, and always did. What Trump proved, again, is that our decline was never inevitable. It was orchestrated, that our manufacturing collapse was not destiny, it was betrayal, and that tariffs properly used aren't tools of war, they're tools of defense and prosperity and sovereignty. The numbers back it, the markets confirm it, the people, once skeptical, are now watching with open eyes. And the final confirmation, you know the strategy is working when the only voices objecting are CNN anchors and Beijing officials, because when tariffs make America stronger, farmers richer, and China weaker, and the only people who object are CNN anchors and Beijing officials, you know you're watching the right strategy, and time is running out for the old game.